Good evening and a warm welcome to the Expert Talk series. My name is Akil Rashid and I'm the Research and Knowledge Hub Chief at JKPI. I'll be starting today's session and introducing the speaker. Jammu and Kashmir Policy Institute has initiated the Expert Talk series to engage experts, changemakers, pioneers from various walks of life to understand the dynamic context of implementing the UN Sustainable Development Goals on our agenda. The vision and the intention of the Expert Talk series is to source inputs and recommendations from experts in various fields pertaining to different sustainable development goals through one-on-one dialogues. In the previous sessions of the Expert Talk series, our guest speakers shared expertise, lived experiences, and policy analysis to help create gender equality and make the world safer for women and girls. Tonight, we are delighted to be joined by Head of Sustainability, Tata Trust's Head of Policy and Advocacy, Tata Trust's Acting Director, India Climate Collaborative, Shaloka Nath. Shaloka Nath currently leads the sustainability and policy and advocacy portfolios at the Tata Trust's, one of India's leading philanthropic foundations. She is also the acting director of the Indian Climate Collaborative and India-led platform founded in 2018 by a group of philanthropies interested in continuing to accelerate India's development while also exceeding its climate goals. Shaloka is the vice president of the Bombay Natural History Society, one of the largest non-governmental organizations in India engaged in conservation and biodiversity research. And she is a member of the advisory board to IUCN's Nature-Based Recovery Initiative. Prior to this, Shaloka co-founded and was the managing partner of the Sankhya Women Impact Fund, a gender Alliance Fund with a focus on sustainability. Shaloka is also an active angel investor in social enterprises and has mentored organizations across sectors. She has spent over a decade in journalism with the BBC in London as a news anchor with New Delhi Television NDTV and principal correspondent with Forbes in Mumbai. With a special emphasis on financial inclusion, sustainability, and public policy. In 2010, Shaloka was nominated for India's highest award in journalism for her reportage on microfinance in India. Shaloka has a master's in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and a BSc in government from the London School of Economics and Political Science. She's also the author of the book Hidden India: Journey to Where the Wild Things Are. Uh, on behalf of the entire team of JKPI, I welcome you tonight. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. Now, without much further ado, I would like to pass on the mantle to Mr. Tanveer, our facilitator for the evening. Over to you, Tanveer.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Akil. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I once again thank Shaloka ma'am for joining us here on the Expert Talk series. So it's really a pleasure to have ma'am you on board. So basically today, as the Expert Talk series is going since, I guess, in 6 weeks. So today we are having the topic gender equality and climate action. So as we all know that climate change represents the most complex challenge of our time. So, and it requires a concerted, proactive, and holistic approach before it does too much damage to the humanity. So basically, climate change, as we all know, it affects the universe. It affects the all living organisms in this world. But can we say that it's biased because it affects women more than men? It has been found in various research that climate change affects men and women differently. It doesn't affect them on the same scale. So basically, as we know that climate change is putting an increasing burden on women. There have been many research. I'm quoting one research from University of King Abdul Aziz University. So as per the research, they have given the few examples. One example is from the cyclone Idai that did hit Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Malawi in 2019. After the cyclone, many women and girls are still facing serious health and sanitary problems because they have not the facilities there at the moment. Likewise, in Ethiopia in 2018, after the drought and flood, 2 lakh people become homeless. And the misery is that women living in overcrowded places, these shelter sheds, they were facing higher risks and higher levels of sexual violence on longer. So basically, without much ado and without wasting too much time on this data, because we are having very limited time, it's just a 1 hour time on this talk series. So I'd like to ask you, ma'am, my first question for tonight. So there are many ongoing debates that support the emergence and use of gender responsive technologies. For instance, low carbon energy technologies can be used to provide electricity in off-grid or underserved areas. But it's also acknowledged that there is a significant challenge towards equitable access to such technologies among men and women. How do you see this scenario, especially the situation in India?
Thank you, Tanveer, and thank you, Akil, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to the whole JKPI team for having me here today. It's really an honor and a privilege to be able to support the kind of work that all of you are doing. And just a little bit of history. My great-great-grandfather actually was from Jammu and Kashmir. So this really means a lot to me. And I think, as I said, the work you're doing is so important. Anyway, that I can support and my organizations can support, we'd be really happy to. So thank you for inviting me here. To answer your question, I think the simplest example that can be used to illustrate this issue is really that of mobile phones. So to give you an example, right, mobile phone usage in India is about 40%. And that's really, compared it to, mobile phone usage by women in India is about 40%. And if you compare 7% of men with mobile phones, own mobile phones. So that gap in itself is just huge. And it's a small but really powerful example. And smartphones really are the easiest way for Indians in rural parts of this country to access the internet. So a lack of mobile phone usage by women is actually really detrimental to their access to information. And there are a lot of reasons behind the statistic. You have, a lot of social norms, literacy, economic disadvantages. But out of all of them, the social norms piece actually trumps all, because there's a lot of discriminatory cultural beliefs which actually, hold women back from literacy and make them more unlikelier than men to own cell phones, even when they're at an equal economic standing. And interestingly, even though female phone ownership actually varies greatly across India's demographics, the gender disparity is not restricted to poorer or less educated groups. But mobile phone access, and the reason I'm talking about it so much, is because it's a really central part of empowerment. It enables wider networks to find jobs, to find, information on your personal rights, government schemes, even notification storm warning systems. And women miss out on all of these. And at the same time, you are completely right when you say, Tanveer, that gender responsive technologies are on the rise. So when I look at the work that, a lot of the organizations and implementers within the ICC network itself, our partners, they are actually working on using green energy to reduce women's drudgery and their time poverty. And this in turn actually really boosts rural micro enterprises. It enables women to access new sources of employment and income. So we're seeing everything from solar powered handlooms to solar powered, chapati makers. We're seeing leading think tanks recognizing that empowering women is a really key part of building that resilience to climate change. And we're also seeing some of India's most powerful corporate and philanthropic leaders who are now risking to these ideas. But as we all know, there are two sides to every understanding of India. We have some of the most progressive thinkers in the world, as well as, really conservative societies. And so while these ideas are picking up and are being recognized by many sections of society, I think putting them into practice is going to require us to not only make the technologies available, but actually change the underlying social and patriarchal norms that have been embedded in men and women alike, which comes back to the point that I opened with. And that's not an easy task to do. But one successful way we've seen this being done in the agricultural sector, I'll give you an example there, is using it to strengthen systems of support for women. This includes efforts by a lot of nonprofits now to increase women's access to information, government schemes, pools of funding, and more. But equally, it depends on self-help groups and rural livelihood missions, existing networks of women's collectives across the country. And it really nurtures these communities of women to enable support and power in numbers. And these two factors together can help women increase their household income and decision-making power, which can help alter that deep set of social beliefs around them. So at the same time, I also want to say it's equally important to work with men to help craft a new understanding of women's agency and to recognize that patriarchy can be a burden on men as well. It's not just women who suffer from it. Again, we have very close partners in this space who are focusing on young men and boys to help them transition to new ways of understanding the world around them and relationships with the women around them. But I'll pause here.
Ma'am, you rightly pointed out key factors. So basically, empowering women in terms of decision-making power in households will for sure be a very beneficial point. Like we have women play a crucial role in natural resource management in the households. So as a research conducted by WHO, in low and middle income countries, 8 out of every 10 women are responsible for collecting water in every household. 8 out of every 10 women in low and middle income countries. So likewise, women are responsible for over 70% of water-related chores and management globally. So even in our country, India, we have, 65% of the total agri workforce as women. But when it comes to the land owning, we have only 12% women who own land. So there's much disparity in this point as well. So, ma'am, my second question, how can gender balance or increased participation of women help in effective climate change policies?
So Tanveer, your statistics were bang on, by the way, and it's really scary when you look at the numbers and you describe it the way you just did. And I think something to just emphasize even in this answer about, how can, more women participating really change or help create more effective climate policies. I think the main thing to understand here is that good development is actually a bedrock to climate resilience. It involves all of the things that we're struggling with today, whether it's investing in social safety nets, investing in high quality accessible healthcare, investing in water resilient structures, in climate resilient agriculture. In the end, the goal is the same, which is to put fewer people at risk. And I think this is really an opportunity for us here in India to mark the beginning of a chapter, a new chapter, where we build a unique development model, right? One that empowers both people, particularly our women and adolescents at the grassroots level. And it also drives Indian business and industry, one that can transform our cities to be more livable and also helps restore rural landscapes. So India is really at a unique place in time and in history right now. We are poised to build a very climate-friendly development paradigm because of this combination of path-breaking technology with increasingly favorable incentives for business, etc. We have, we have currently low per capita emission levels and the potential of a very young population. I mean, look at all of you on this call today. So this is an opportunity for India to really promote sustainable agriculture, to promote resource efficiency and circularity across sectors, as well as supply chains. This is an opportunity for us to push green jobs and green local enterprises. And within this model, we do have to acknowledge that the climate crisis is going to impact different groups very differently, with the greatest impacts on marginalized and vulnerable communities. And even within these communities, there is a pressing need to develop context-specific solutions because of the various ways in which climate impacts will manifest. So to give you an example, women and adolescents whose livelihoods depend on natural resources like agriculture or fishing, they are impacted differently by a changing climate than marginalized women in urban areas. Or another example, adolescents living in the coastal Konkan region will require adaptations that are distinct from adolescents living in drought-prone districts of Maharashtra, on the hills of Assam, on the mountains in Kashmir. We need to recognize that we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach to deal with a crisis of this scale and urgency. So because of these factors, India is going to need to plan and accommodate a very key demographic in its green recovery measures, and that really is women. And when I say green recovery, I mean how we build this economy back in a more sustainable, greener way, following, of course, the pandemic.
You mentioned key points, and I just noted one point, that's green jobs or green enterprise. So basically, India, we live in a country which is among the top 10 countries that's going to be affected by climate change, and it is affected. And in coming 80 years, if we are not able to curb this greenhouse gas emission and the other effects, so India will be having a 4 degrees Celsius increase in the annual mean temperature over the next 80 years. And that will for sure bring in more floods, more natural disasters. Like we had one natural disaster in the Feb 2021 and Uttarakhand, where almost 70 people lost their lives and almost 140 people are still missing. So these calamities will come along and will come in a very big way in case we are not able to curb this greenhouse gas emissions. So ma'am, India has its own national action plan for climate change. So India was among the, I guess, first 10 countries globally that had their own policy for this climate change or climate action. So like the Earth Day started in 1970, in 1940, I guess 1942, it was Rio de Janeiro. So these were all called for this protection of all life on Earth. And then United Nations came up with the Millennium Development Goals in 2000, which were replaced by the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, which were applicable from year 2016. So ma'am, my next question to you is regarding India's National Action Plan on Climate Change. So as we know that India has its own National Action Plan for Climate Change, how far do you think it's guided by a gender-sensitive approach?
So, great question. And I'll be honest with you. To counter the impact of climate change, the government has responded with the announcement of a lot of international and national commitments in terms of the climate change policies and plans. However, gender concerns and issues are actually very wanting in these initiatives. They're not really present. So for all of the talk about empowering them, women are actually conspicuous by their absence at every stage of the decision-making processes. In addition, while women and children remain the most vulnerable, as I mentioned earlier, to the impacts of disasters, you mentioned the one in Uttarakhand, and they're, most vulnerable because of those very skewed power relationships I mentioned earlier, because of the inequitable cultural and social norms. I do want to mention, though, that they are the most important pillar for creating change. Their knowledge, their position, their potential of women, it makes them the most indispensable part of the solution. So actually, gender and social analysis actually becomes really critical at this level, and it has to be extended to all climate actions. So to give you an example, adaptation programs for climate change, they have to be designed with a strong focus on women and gender equity. And here's where philanthropy and foundations have a really important role to play. Because you need to create very real, very robust partnerships between and among government, philanthropists, civil society organizations, businesses. These are all the needs of the hour because we need a concerted effort towards mitigating that adverse impacts of climate change on women.
And you rightly mentioned, and we can say that gender equality and climate resilience, these both are a two-way relationship. It's a two-way relationship. Progress in one can drive progress in the other, kind of symbiotic relationship. So ma'am, my next question
you have to
is...
stop calling me ma'am. Please call
okay,
me
Shloka, sorry. Shoka. Okay, so now my next question is on gender analysis. But before we move to gender analysis, let us take a look on the climate finance. It's an important term nowadays considered in this climate action. So climate finance should be accessible to both men and women. It should be designed in a way so it should generate mutual benefits to both men and women. So how can gender analysis of all budget lines and financial instruments for climate change be useful?
It's a great question, and it's one that we're currently trying to figure out. So one of our goals when we built the India Climate Collaborative was really to increase funding into the climate sector, especially domestic funding. And we also aim to increase the efficiency of climate action. We want to build the capacity of climate actors, donors, investors, to really act on climate change. And this last year, actually, we've been thinking a lot about climate change and its impact on women and girls, and about what that would mean for climate finance. And across India, what we found is that women mostly depend on natural resources for their livelihood in comparison to men. So that's one reason that why they're also more impacted by climate change. The impacts of climate change, as I mentioned earlier, are also different in different parts of the country. Again, to give you some examples, in the Sundarbans, women have to deal with the migration of their husbands because they don't have agricultural opportunities in their hometowns anymore. In the hills of Assam, they have to walk further to collect wood for fire and other resources. And for women, as I mentioned, who live in that drought-prone region of Maharashtra, we see a lot of the impact on their sexual and reproductive health as a big challenge. So since women spend also most of their time working outdoors, they are also at the receiving end of rising temperatures. They find it harder to continue working longer hours. And additionally, gender disparities in ownership and access to resources like land, like credit, technology, coupled with a lot of those socio-cultural barriers, which I mentioned, they really impoverish women, and they lower their adaptive capacity and increase their exposure to climate risk. So you're being exposed further, and you're not able to adapt to climate risks. So strategic climate finance actually could really catalyze women's empowerment. How finance is deployed, how instruments and programs are designed, they are going to be critical to ensuring no further exclusion of women from positive outcomes. So for us to be able to do this, we need a gendered analysis of financing mechanisms, including very specific examinations, as you mentioned, of program budgets to assess this gendered analysis. And I think one of the challenges, quite honestly, that we're facing right now is that there is a lack of credible data to develop, updated relevant analysis. And we see that right now, aid to climate change adaptation, it has a stronger focus on gender equality than aid to mitigation. So that's another big difference. In 2013, there was a report by the OECD that stated that of the total climate-related overseas, funds that were coming in, that focused on on gender equality, 46% of those actually targeted climate change adaptation, and only 19% targeted climate mitigation. So again, gender responsive approaches are needed across all climate related sectors, whether it is, whether gender equality is well integrated into climate related agriculture and water. It's actually really poorly addressed in economic infrastructure sectors. So to give you an example again, in 2013, only 11% of climate-related aid to energy and 12% to transport actually targeted gender equality. So you can see on the mitigation side how low that is in terms of addressing gender equality outcomes. Almost no climate aid to these sectors targeted gender equality as a principal objective. And by that, I mean they didn't focus on gender equality in any way. It was a part of it, but not something that they wanted to actually achieve as in terms of a major outcome. So the focus on gender equality in adaptation programs, it's really important. It's critical, given that women are particularly impacted by the negative effects of climate change, as I mentioned. And as I said earlier, they play a really crucial role in the adaptation efforts. So integrating a gender perspective in adaptation activities, it's really critical to ensure that interventions respond to the needs of women and girls, that we don't actually end up exacerbating inequalities, and that we can contribute to empowering women to drive change at all levels of the adaptation process. Despite this, as I mentioned, that OECD report, it says that over half the aid to climate change adaptation actually fails to take account of women's specific needs and contributions. And again, mitigation activities, which aim to decrease greenhouse gas emissions, so things like support for technology development and capacity building, they provide really important opportunities actually to improve women's health and livelihoods, and really create new possibilities for women's economic participation and empowerment, particularly in the renewable energy sector. So more efforts are actually needed to ensure that we have, mitigation and technology development activities. These are both designed for the benefit of women and men and contribute to the advancement of gender equality. So, what can we do about this? To reverse the underinvestment in gender equality across sectors, more really needs to be done to improve opportunities for women to participate in the green economy. Notably, we need to make sure that women benefit equally from development projects that focus on clean technology and renewable energy. And I think the way to do that is really focus on financial and digital literacy that addresses those barriers to participation for women and raise more awareness. I think, again, a very interesting statistic for all of you is that only right now, only 20 to 24% of jobs in the renewable energy sector are actually held by women. Yet, projections show that green jobs could lead to millions of new employment opportunities in the next few years. So we have an opportunity to invest in programs that will empower a large number of women to be employed for such green jobs. At the same time, you have development programs that support the distribution of clean cook stoves. And they've had a significant impact on reducing emissions and limiting premature deaths, illnesses linked to indoor air pollution, particularly benefiting women and children. I think a good example of this actually is the Grameen Shakti mitigation program in Bangladesh. And it's a very well-known initiative. And it trains women as solar technicians to install and maintain solar home systems in rural households, which are not connected to electricity. And this program has proven really effective in enabling women to gain access to new skills and employment opportunities while improving the lives of local communities. Again, I don't want to go on and on, but there are so many examples. On the adaptation side, you can take examples of investments in agriculture. In order to design a gender-sensitive program or instrument, you require an understanding of what those inherent social, cultural, economic norms are, which impact the way women engage with the agricultural ecosystem in rural communities. On the farm, like giving you some examples, women cultivators are typically responsible for tasks that are perceived to be lighter work. In spite of the fact that these tasks are highly manual and they're drudgery prone, they require spending extensive amount of time on the. And women cultivators have the dual responsibility, of course, of managing household tasks and working on the farm. While household responsibilities are unpaid, they take up a significant amount of time. The economic contribution of women cultivators on their own field is also going completely unmeasured. So social norms limit mobility. They limit the ability of women cultivators to take on front-facing high-value roles. They also limit access to productive resources like land, like extension services, tools, finance. All of these are relatively easier to access for their male counterparts. And lower levels of income and reduced control over agricultural profits also limits the level of empowerment of women cultivators and what they can achieve. I just want to give you quick examples of a few organizations that are really working to support women laborers. So there's Gravis, and they have a project called Enhancing Women and Girls Leadership, or EWGL, in climate change adaptation specifically, and that focuses on creating rainwater harvesting structures, promoting rain-fed farming practices, and supporting other measures around drought mitigation. And I think one last point on the climate finance piece is that we need to be mindful that climate finance has to be prioritized for projects that mainstream gender considerations throughout the life cycle of a program. So for instance, in the planning stage, you would, think about gender or bring in gender through, collecting gender disaggregated baseline data collection. And you would select appropriate indicators, and in the execution phase later on, it would be really critical then to include components like gender sensitization within the larger community. You want inclusive and accessible delivery mechanisms and sites. And when evaluating outcomes, ensuring such processes are holistic and representative of women's voices as well. You want to make sure that your outcomes, showcase that. So while women and children remain the most vulnerable to impacts of disasters due to these power relations, inequitable cultural and social norms, again, I want to emphasize this, they happen to be one of the most important pillars for creating change. And we really need to recognize that their knowledge and role in society really puts them in a unique position to lead that change. And, women play an important role in sectors like agriculture, biodiversity, forests, to income generation in households, which helps them recognize patterns in climate change and gives them the capacity to be knowledge producers. problem solvers, leaders in the fight against climate change. So we have to invest in solutions that build this knowledge base of theirs, as well as create channels to leverage their knowledge and share it with the larger community. I will pause here. This is a very long answer, but hopefully it covered a few of the points that you asked.
Yeah, ma'am, you answered the question with very good live examples, and I think it did fit the cup. So one more term I came from this answer is climate extremes. So by this we mean that men who are leaving to find more income after a natural disaster or natural calamity, and it puts an additional burden on the women folk who are at their home. So it puts extra burden in terms of the women who have to take care of the family, who have to earn money and do a lot of work besides all this. So now, as you already referred, I would like to intervene that women leaders and women politicians, these can have a positive role in the upliftment and involvement of women in more government schemes. And like you also said that many schemes go unnoticed. At many places, women don't get the share they ought to get. So before I move ahead with another question, I have my colleague Jigyasa who wants to ask a question. Jigyasa, out to you, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tanvi. And I believe before we move forward and I ask my question, what is more important at the moment is first to actually look at the answer that ma'am have just given, because we started with climate finance, but we actually covered a lot of things in this entire framework. So whether it's about the social cultural norm that actually limits the potential of women, and at the same time women being the agents of change specifically at the rural level, and what are the various disparities, then coming to the point of why we need capacity building specifically in financial and digital literacy, and then actually where is the potential to have and implement those capacity building is green jobs that we already have heard from ma'am that there is a great scope to have green jobs coming in where women can actually increase their participation. And then there was a good example of Grameen Shakti Bangladesh. Now my question is actually related to one specific point that you mentioned that was regarding data. We all know that we need credible data to actually build uh, intervention that are very contextualized and it represents the actual need of the people. And I believe that, and I really think that not just me, but all of our audience are really eager to learn about the context of India, how prepared are we? So when you mentioned that we need gender disaggregated data, so I just want to ask you that, do you really think, and based on your experience, what you have observed, do we really have the methodology with us to actually collect that data?
Do we have the
Do we
necessary,
have
sorry, I missed the last.
the methodology that is basically required? Do we have the resources at the same time? And if we have methodology, if we have resources at the same time, are various organizations and stakeholders, are they actually collecting the data and working on that? So yeah, that's my basic question. Back to you, ma'am.
Firstly, Jigyasa, thank you for summing that giant podcast that I just gave for this last answer. Thank you. You've done a wonderful job and made and really broken it down. I think the answer to your question at this point is no. We don't actually have the requisite sort of data or frameworks that are required to answer these questions. It's some of the work that we're trying to do right now, and it's the work that we need to do. I can give you a quick sort of example in terms of what we ourselves are trying to do at the ICC. But I think before I say that, I think one thing that we do need to recognize, and I can maybe tell you a bit about this, in terms of some anecdotes again, is that while climate change does affect everyone, there are, again, as I mentioned, these social and economic norms that really limit women's agency, right? And it makes them more vulnerable to these adverse outcomes, whether it's diseases and more nutritional issues, mobility and employment, or lack of natural resource management, or etc. I'll give you an example. In the Beed district in Maharashtra, which is completely drought stricken, many women actually migrate to perform backbreaking agricultural labor. And I mentioned this earlier, but because these women can't afford to take leave around their menstrual cycles and have no access to toilets in the fields, a number of women in their early 20s have actually undergone hysterectomy. And the rate of uterus removal procedures in BID is actually 14 times higher than the rest of the state and the country, according to a lot of civil society organizations on the ground. And this is just one of the many heartbreaking stories about this unfolding crisis and how it's impacting women. And as you rightly said or alluded to, Jigyasa, at this critical intersection of gender and climate, there's still so much that we don't know. There are so many issues about which we need to rapidly learn and gather insights. And it's a very highly complex space. And we have to develop the right questions and frameworks through which we can address the challenges that women and girls face through climate change and the role they can play in combating it. And to give you a quick sense of what we're doing at the ICC, we're exploring a landscaping exercise right now with Basra to narrow that scope of study and understand what the key subsectors are, like the impact of climate change on sexual and reproductive health, or how a warming world raises migration issues for women and adolescent girls. And we're doing this through discussions, informational interviews, data collection. We actually really hope to develop a very foundational piece of work that will inform future research priorities and actions, because there is increasing evidence about the broad challenges, but very little information about subsectors. And so the study that we're hoping to do is really aimed at understanding these key questions we have to ask. What is being ignored? What do we need to collectively prioritize while thinking about this intersection? And I think, again, just to sum up the point on data knowledge and creation, what can funders do in this space? Or what, where are the gaps and what can we do? One of the things that we realized was there's a need to sort of even create a repository of organizations working in climate change, specifically at the intersections of gender and adolescence. We don't actually have, this kind of a database right now, but it would allow actors in the space to identify each other, to create opportunities for collaboration. We need to have, more disclosure around projects that are being funded in this country to allow for everyone in the ecosystem to understand the sources and destinations of funding, of money, who is supporting what. And then we can actually start bridging those gaps in funding. We need to conduct a scoping study about the need of marginalized communities impacted by climate change. We need to then build customized programs to build resilience to those impacts. And we have to commission things like long-term studies to track the impact of climate emergencies on women and children. So, for instance, we know that when climate emergencies happen, it really disrupts education. We're seeing it with the pandemic, but there aren't studies to determine the long-term impacts, like health issues, that could actually come up a decade or so later. But these are just a couple of quick examples to give you around that data and knowledge piece.
Thank you, ma'am. So basically, we're talking of customizing programs that will for sure help in getting, like you said, that who is supporting what. It's a very key point, who is supporting what. This will help a lot. So as we are running out of time, so my next question, as head of sustainability, you have been working on climate, energy, and environment, implementing and funding sustainable and scalable. What has been your experience regarding incorporating gender dimension in your work towards developing more sustainable solutions?
Great question, Tanveer. I think, so, I'm going to talk about it specifically from the lens of philanthropy and the work that we've been doing as a foundation and where we recognize gaps. I think just maybe putting it in context for you, starting with, where we stand on climate change, philanthropic support. So in India right now, we have a lot of multilateral and intergovernmental action. It has been galvanized in the last 2 decades. We have a lot of philanthropic action towards but sorry, what I mean is while we've seen a lot of intergovernmental action and a lot of multilateral action towards climate change, philanthropic action towards climate itself is very low. So less than 2%, and this is not just in India, this is globally, less than 2% of global philanthropic funding is actually dedicated to climate change mitigation. And that's a huge gap, as you can imagine. In the Indian context, philanthropy has actually tended to focus on a lot of development sector issues, social economic challenges that we're facing. And climate change comes much lower in that list of priorities. So actually, what we're trying to do in terms of building that ecosystem for climate action, because investing in climate action in India is a very long haul. It requires a lot of persistence and patience. You're not going to necessarily see the outcomes that you want tomorrow. They'll be years down the line, in fact. So what we have realized is that there is a really great need to take a look at how we are working on climate change, how we're continuing to fund it, what our response mechanisms need to be. And within that, starting to identify and address these long-standing gender inequalities as well. So, one thing we have to make sure is that philanthropies and foundations, while we're targeting climate action, that the response and sustainable recovery efforts that we're building, they cannot be suspect to gender agnosticism. They cannot be indifferent to gender or discrimination. They have to really think about things in a very holistic way. And gender, of course, is a huge part of that. So, I mentioned to you some of the pieces that we were looking at from the data side. There's also the capacity building element, right? So a few ideas there and things that we can do and what we need to do. And this is something that's come up through our work, at the sustainability portfolio at the Tata Trust, and of course through the ICC, is that we really have to start building programs that are focused on creating climate resilient livelihood opportunities. And this falls under the umbrella of general capacity building for the ecosystem. How do we build the Indian ecosystem's capacity to respond and act on climate change? So the first is build programs that are focused on climate resilient livelihood opportunities. So, you can build programs that really help upskill the youth, away from vulnerable sectors, and you look to implement those skills that are going to be necessary to succeed in coming decades. We just spoke about renewable energy and green jobs. We need to sort of design programs that will help communities respond to climate disasters. We need to work with marginalized communities to understand, what are their existing issues, how do they currently function and survive, and we have to build, as I said, customized capacity building program really speak to their needs on the ground. It has to have proper representation of communities from different vulnerable and socially marginalized groups, including, for instance, Dalit and Adivasi women. We're not talking to these groups at all. That's a few examples on the capacity building side. On policy and advocacy side and legislation side, we really have to engage with government to create incentives for the public to shift towards much more greener alternatives. Seeing it in the electric vehicles policies, we need more of these policies and across the board. We have to get government to champion, increasing social security nets for women, to increase specific schemes that are focused on marginalized women. We have to get government, work with government to build forums and dialogues to bring together civil society, the private sector, government stakeholders, to really collaborate and coordinate efforts towards climate change action. We have to think about providing technical advisory services to governments, especially at the state and municipal level, because guess what, they are also facing a major talent shortage in the talent pool when it comes to how to address climate change issues. It's a technical subject as well. We have to look at it from an advocacy perspective. We need to conduct campaigns to publicly recognize the problem of gender inequalities in climate action. And we have to really work with organizations to think about how they're going to bring in gender equality in their strategies, in their missions, in their work plans, in their public engagements. So there's a huge amount of we have to do on a number of different fronts, but I'll pause here and hand it back to you.
Rightfully said, ma'am. As a small question arising out of this discussion is why there is such low interest among philanthropists to fund climate-related initiatives. Though it's a very big and challenging task. So, but why there is low interest among philanthropists?
I don't think that it's a lack of wanting to work on climate. I think there are a number of entry barriers for most of these philanthropists, or philanthropic foundations. Climate change is a big intangible, area of work. How do you define climate change? Tanveer, what you say is climate may not be the same way I think about climate change. So how are we creating that common baseline for understanding? It's a big intangible thing right now. No one's really able to wrap their head around it. Then, as I mentioned, you have a big entry barrier because it's a very technical space, and so people don't necessarily have the talent or the right resources to work on it. The third is we are very far away from, when it comes to foundations, from talking about conversations like urbanization or future visioning technologies. We've left those conversations to the government and to business, and we're really not involved in the thought leadership that needs to come. Of course, this is a generalization, and it's not true for all foundations in India. It's a matter of, as I said, climate change also being a very new thing in this space. We've been working in the development sector for many, many years. I think what I do want to say is we've been working in many climate related areas. So we've been working in agriculture or wash or sanitation. We just haven't started putting in that climate filter or lens, very similar to how we put in a gender lens, or want to put in a gender lens into programs. We need to also risk proof our programs and portfolios to climate. And I think that understanding is now starting to happen. That groundswell of there is something that, is impacting the quality of life of the people that we seek to serve, the communities we want to protect. And, increasing the subsistence yield of a farmer by 100% is, a wonderful thing to do, but it's not going to overall improve his quality of life if we don't address climate change and how that's impacting him. And I think that understanding is now really starting to become a big part of, the work in the development sector. But it's a nascent field of philanthropy, and the work we're really doing at the ICC is to build that field, to build that proof of concept for why it's so important to work on climate change.
Yeah, I think this will go up the pyramid. And you rightly said, it's just 2% of the total global funding. So we hope that it goes up because it's need of the hour at the moment. So, ma'am, you have been working with various sectors like government, relevant industry organizations, and development sector leaders. Based on your observation, how far do you think these actors have succeeded to ensure a more gender-sensitive approach?
Empower women as gender disparate in India, we do persist even against this backdrop of so-called economic growth. Over the last 16 years, India has a gender budget. I don't know how many of you know this, but I just wanted to point out that it's something myself and my team realized quite recently, that we have a gender budget, and over the last 16 years, it has seen a 6-fold increase in absolute terms. But if you look at these allocations, the proportion of the total budget, we've stayed constant between 4.3 to 5.9%. So the allocation in the last 5 to 6 years has actually been less than 5% of the total budget. So an essential first step to gender budgeting itself is determining the outcomes and then defining what inputs will be needed to achieve them. But in India, it's done more as an aggregation exercise or of different schemes or ministries. So, despite its shortcomings, one of the biggest achievements of gender responsive budgeting is the mainstreaming of the idea that a gender lens is important within the fiscal discourse. In fact, studies have found that gender budgeting can help reduce gender gaps in educational attainment and have helped in reducing violence against women. I just want to say that while targeted programs have helped reduce sectoral inequalities, they have a long way to go towards eliminating inequalities. So gender budgeting policies actually should not assume that all women are equal, and therefore they have to focus on adopting intersectionality. And to add to this, there's an increased focus on gender lens investing by the development sector leaders and other investors, and GLI, as we call it, as a strategy, is increasingly being leveraged by asset managers, large institutional investors, development agencies, family foundations, retail investors. But it's still at its nascent stage, especially in Asia. And it's growing, it's taking on a lot of inclusive and diverse approaches. We're seeing that emerge. And as the development sector takes on the COVID-19 crisis, I think the right approach towards investment management and resource allocation can go a long way in strengthening the ability of communities to fight and build resilience. And moving to the corporate sector, the 2030 SDG agenda actually acknowledges the corporate sector as a key partner to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, including the achievement of gender equality. In India, While CSR interest in women's economic empowerment is very high, as you can imagine, the total expenditure is currently low. So if we do focus on a more gender-sensitive approach to the development sector as well as the government, they actually need to work together and focus on resolving these pain points. We're not there yet, but with collaborative efforts, we can create a more inclusive, gender-sensitive India together. I really do believe that.
Yeah, ma'am, as we're already aware that 1 hour is never going to be enough for this discussion. So I have another interruption. My colleague Akil wants to ask a question. So Akil, over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you, Tanveer. Thank you so much. So Shaloka, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. So is it?
You are.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a big problem in pronouncing names. Even I can't sometimes pronounce my own name correctly. I don't know why. So I'm really sorry. So all that you have highlighted so far with regard to climate change and related issues are very real and rarely discussed issues in our part of the world, that's Jammu and Kashmir. And today's session actually would be a good place to start a debate on such issues. And I have a question on that point. If you lived here in Kashmir, where the ecosystems are sensitive to climate change, where could we possibly start to discuss the climate change? It's a question I believe I know it's a question that needs to be studied before it's answered. But I would like you to say a few words about it.
Sure. I think, the answer for Kashmir is true for a lot of India in the sense that it's a region that's highly vulnerable and prone to risk or climate risk. And I think there are maybe 4 ways I would break that down in terms of how I would answer or where you could start. And maybe because this is a policy think tank, that's the right way to do it. The first is, of course, isolated climatic events, right? We have a situation in India where we have climate change completely exacerbating natural disasters. Kashmir, of course, is highly prone to this. You have rogue weather events. To give you an example, we had a heat wave in 2015. I don't know how many of you remember this in India, and it claimed over 2,300 lives. And those sort of issues are only going to rise. We're going to see more and more extreme weather events. So again, in post-disaster environments, you're going to see these challenges, only increasing. Challenges for women are going to be compounded by health, sanitation, safety, economic, as well as cultural concerns. So that's one bracket, is just this increasing level of climate-related events. And, as I said, Kashmir is something, Jammu and Kashmir is obviously where you're going to see a lot of this take place. The second is something that I would classify as food systems. Agriculture and food security is going to take by far the hardest hit from climate change in India. And again, it's an area I would focus on very much for J&K. It's been found that climate change will single-handedly distort and diminish agricultural incomes and productivity. You're going to find unirrigated areas that are going to be the hardest hit by temperatures and declines in rainfall. Climate change will affect 52% of India's total land under agriculture. And of course, there's a great deal of that in J&K. And again, to bring it back to the gender piece, India is predominantly agrarian. Tanveer mentioned this earlier. Women play a vital role in that industry. So given, the high prevalence of women in agriculture, their lack of land rights, increasing probability and frequency of these extreme weather events, it's really going to impact their livelihood and security. The third bracket would be human capital, because climate change poses a risk not only to physical infrastructure, but also to the human capital of billions of people, right? It's going to take a toll on health, livelihoods. It's going to displace people. You're going to see a huge impact on access for women, access to sanitation and sexual and reproductive rights. And this is true for all, vulnerable communities. But the first thing that happens during a climate emergency is loss of access to health services. And we are seeing this play out right now in our country with the COVID-19 crisis. It's only going to get worse with climate change. So when natural resources become scarce due to climate change, what you will find is you will see girls and women who are going to be further exposed to sexual abuse, physical harm, while also dealing with a lack of access to essential health services and sanitation. I'm just giving you a general sense and then breaking it down to women and girls. And finally, the last point I'd say that would really be very crucial for JNK is natural capital. It is one of the most beautiful places on the planet. There is rapid changes in India's climate, which of course is going to mean that you're going to see a lot of stress on natural ecosystems within JNK. Freshwater resources, agricultural output, of course. And that's going to also, of course, cause a lot of escalating damage to infrastructure. And again, just closing on the women's part and how that will affect them, it's really going to impact women in rural areas more with natural resource use and conservation than men. And so it's something to really be aware of, because there are traditional gender roles which bring them into daily contact with natural resources like land, like water, like forest, like wildlife. Women are going to be worse impacted here. So these are the 4 areas I would say JNK needs to focus on as well.
Thank you so much for answering my question and raising a few alarms also. Since we are running short on time, I would like Tanvi to very quickly ask one last question before I could present a vote of thanks. Over to you, Tanvir.
Thank you, Akhil. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to ask me at least one last question. So Shloka, asking question after question, maybe there are 2 reasons. One, we are being very selfish here. 2, and the reason why we are being selfish, we are going to make every moment count, because this 1 hour is never going to be enough. So since you hold a strong background in public policy, what suggestions would you have for policymakers to effectively focus on the intersection of gender and climate to develop more wholesome policies?
Great question. I'll try and keep this short because I know we're running out of time and you had to listen to my voice for an hour now. Policy measures, I think, from the last decade have actually contributed towards establishing the scientific basis of climate change as a global crisis, but they have really failed to comprehend or acknowledge the social and human dimensions of the problem. And I think this is also something that will answer, your earlier question around why aren't more philanthropies doing more? Because we haven't framed it in the right way. We haven't talked about the human impact of this issue. And the responses have been primarily technocratic, very economically oriented, but there's a glaring absence of a focus on gender. There's a very asymmetric distribution of power between these affected stakeholders. Climate and development experts have now started exploring pathways for climate action that is centered on women and adolescents. So what you're finding is globally, there are now a number of studies which are coming out to assess the projected impact of climate change on women. While women and children remain the most vulnerable to these impacts of disasters, etc., again, they are the most important pillar for creating change. And I can't emphasize this enough. Climate action cannot be successful or sustainable if it does not involve women and adolescent girls. The UN Secretary General has also singled out women's leadership because of their unique ability as drivers of solutions when they're empowered. So women can play a really critical role, because of their knowledge, their local knowledge of natural resources. It positions them well to contribute to livelihood strategies, which of course are right now what we're trying to adapt to these changing environmental realities. Women can really help shape what those livelihood strategies should look and feel like. So they are the biggest knowledge banks of what works on the ground and what doesn't. And as I said earlier, to give you an example, because women play such an important role in agriculture, they're the most affected by a water or fuel shortage, and they're better at responding to these events. Their experiences can be leveraged to make them lead these adaptation efforts. To give you a couple of quick sort of, what are some of the structural things and institutional interventions that we can do to enhance the entitlements of women, to help meet these larger goals of inclusive climate priorities. I'll give you 2 examples at the individual and community level, and then I'll stop. Individual level, you have, I think, a situation where, it's really important, as I mentioned, going back to my earlier point about, mobile social security, You're going to see a lot more migration on the ground in India, and you're going to see people who are going to experience a lot of mobility shocks like the migrant workers did during the pandemic. So you need the delivery of schemes at the individual level, like the PM Ujwala Yojana, which can increase energy access, or reduce the high incidence of respiratory diseases due to poor air quality. This is really important in rural areas, and schemes like the PM Ujwala Yojana are actually really important for women who are limited in these traditional roles within the household. So I'm just giving you an example of how to leverage sort of schemes, not just, of course, air pollution, etc., but that schemes that ensure food security. The PM Awas Yojana that provides housing and various labor policies. These can all factor in climate impacts, which they don't right now. And several prominent researchers and policy experts are recommending even that the PDS, the public distribution system in India, should be made portable so that citizens can draw rations in case they've migrated to other places for work. At the community level, really quickly, we can bolster climate-related training for Anganwadi and other frontline workers. They operate through bonds of trust at the community level, and they can be really essential to building information and awareness about issues like exposure to extreme heat, how to avail of maternal benefits, doorstep delivery of rations, and coping with disasters. We're really seeing them come to the forefront now with the pandemic. And last example I'll give you is, at the urban level, organizations like the Mahila Housing Seva Trust, they demonstrate how women can play a really vital role in nudging urban, force towards lower energy patterns. So, they're really helping us see how we can reduce the burden of electricity costs on household incomes. And urbanization, one of the expected outcomes of unchecked emissions pathway that will make large parts of rural India inhospitable because of extreme heat. So women in these informal housing settlements, they really play a key role in making urban habitats greener, using eco-friendly materials, mitigating the impact of urban heat islands. These are just some of the things we can do at the policy level, really utilizing structural interventions to sort of bring about that necessary change, and using women as agents of change to bring about sort of that protection to climate impacts going forward. So again, I'll pause here and hand it back to you, Tanveer.
Thank you so much. So we have one quick question. I want a very brief answer from this. Is someone, Anuja Sharma, is asking, are you focusing at all on educating women on the importance of limiting the number of children they have or are forced to have? Or massive population is such a problem on so many fronts, including climate degradation.
Yes, I completely agree. It is a massive issue. And there is, part of sort of the work that's being done on the healthcare side with, sensitizing and raising awareness within these communities is being done, again, using women as agents for change and promoting, family planning awareness and how that plays into, of course, increasing protection and lowering vulnerability to climate impacts going forward. So that is very much a part of how we are looking at using women as agents of change going forward.
Thank you for the brief and quick answer. Basically, we have a lot of questions, but I'm not sure we'll be able to ask a single more question. But the questions we have, if anybody has more questions, you can mail us or text us. We'll ask them for the answers and we'll respond to you. So before moving, okay, Akhil, over to you now for the vote of thanks.
I would be amiss if I don't mention this, that the session was very short, but it was very useful. It provided us all an opportunity to learn more about the crucial issue, the most important issue facing the humans, that's climate change. And the whole JKPI team joins me in thanking you for adding the necessary depth and perspective to our understanding of gender equality and climate action. Thank you for all the work you do. It's wonderful and deeply appreciated. Though 1 hour was not enough to make most of the experience and knowledge that you possess on climate and sustainability, but nevertheless, we learned a lot from today's interaction and look forward to our interactions in the future. JKPI wish you all the best for the future. Thank you so much for joining us today and sparing your precious time with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the whole JKPI team. It was, as I said, my honor and privilege to be here tonight. Thank you again.